how does your worldview, and this is for you, Eugene, provide a foundation for true justice? How do we know what that is? And I guess, and then we'll ask David the same question.
I don't know. I mean, I think that the best we can do is try to think about what is just and what is not. I do think that there are evolved mechanisms within our psychology that find certain things to trigger sort of a sense of injustice. I think there's some experiments that indicate this. I think from an early age, kids show certain kinds of attitudes towards justice, although it often has to do with justices whether they're getting what they feel they deserve. But I mean, we are wired for empathy. I think there's no doubt about that. We're wired for empathy. We're wired for love. We're wired probably for hatred and certainly for anger. But I do think that there are mechanisms within our minds that allow us to think about these things. And that if you reflect sometime, I like to think that one thing that happened with regard to slavery is that if you think long enough about not even equality, but just liberty, at some point you sort of have to start reflecting and saying, how can I be saying liberty for me and fighting a revolutionary war of liberty for me, and not be thinking about that with regard to others who seem just as human as I am. So I think that between empathy, between a certain degree of moral sense that we have innate in us, between that and judgments about equality, and I don't think reason alone is going to get you very far on these things, but I do think that it can help guide us to certain decisions. I think we can improve things, and I think a lot of the improvement that we have seen has stemmed from that. But yeah, I can't claim this is at all a firm foundation for assured progress towards justice. I just don't see anything much more that has much of a firm foundation.
You don't even have to ask a question at this point. I agree with Eugene completely. Not. Although I will say this, I do agree.
Do you agree with me? You disagree with me completely, or you agree with me not completely?
You tell me which it is when I get finished talking.
Sounds good.
So one thing that I would say is all of the things or several of the things that Eugene is talking about, which I think are really interesting, and accurate, such as our innate capacity for empathy, and also a tendency to misbehave that we have that wrestles with that empathy for supremacy within us. One of the things that really strikes me about these findings, which are becoming increasingly prominent in psychology, is they seem to me to confirm, I'll call a Christian, but we could say Judeo-Christian, a Judeo-Christian understanding of our nature. And I think this understanding of our nature is essential as a foundation for justice. So what is the Judeo-Christian understanding of our nature? The understanding is that each of us is made in the image of God. And we need to recognize that God loves each of us equally. Sounds a lot like empathy. We're each made in the image of God, and this is where the idea of loving one's neighbor comes from. It spins out of that. But at the same time, we're also sinful. We also have an innate tendency to misbehave. That is the standard Judeo-Christian understanding of what humans are like. And it seems to me that a lot of the psychological findings that people sometimes think of as completely separate from Christianity really are confirming a Christian understanding of the world. And I think that an understanding of justice needs to start with this as a foundation. So when you talk about how we can think about justice, I want to put I want to say more than just we're muddling through and we have a certain amount of empathy. I want to say that our justice should start with the principle that each of us is made in the image of God, and that our legal system and our culture should reflect that. But it also should recognize the fact that we have a tendency to misbehave, or what Christians would call a sinfulness about us. And the legal system needs to balance those two elements of human behavior. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously said that without law and without a government, which he called Leviathan, life would be nasty, brutish, and short. And I think there is something to that. The problem is, if we just assume that ordinary people are sinful and we need to restrain them through law, there's a tendency to forget that lawmakers and law enforcers also are sinful. And that if we give them too much authority, they're likely to misbehave. And it seems to me that from this, we get a foundation for what a legal system should look like. And it has two somewhat contradictory, or seemingly contradictory, but both important qualities, it seems to me. We have an obligation to pursue justice and to seek the well-being of others on the one hand, but we also need to be realistic about the capacity of justice, and that a just legal system, it will inevitably be a humble legal system. One of the ironies of human nature, it seems to me, is that less is more with law. The less we try to do very frequently with law, the better and more effective the law will be. When we try to do too much with law, often the results are counterproductive. I think that was one of the problems with the culture, with Christians in the culture wars over the last generation. We've tried to do too much with law, in my view. The one other thing I'll say is, just to continue a little bit of the distinction between my perspective and Eugene's, Christianity does provide a foundation for justice, and it does provide an obligation to pursue justice. You might not agree with Christianity, you might not believe it, but if you accept it, if you are persuaded that Christianity tells us how we can be reconciled with God, it creates an obligation to pursue justice, and it also provides a way to think about justice. And I believe that there's disagreement about lots of elements, but I think there is more agreement than disagreement as to what Christianity says about justice. A muddling through kind of view does not give you any foundation for justice. So if Eugene is making all the decisions, I'm kind of comfortable because Eugene is really, really smart. You probably haven't noticed this yet, but he is very smart, and he has really good judgment. And so if Eugene were setting up our legal system, I'd be comfortable with it. I read his blog, and I go, you tell him, Eugene, when I read his blog. But when other people who have other views, who are also muddling through, are in control, bad things often happen. And the point here, the important point, I think, is if you don't have an objective foundation, objective basis for justice, you don't have any sure way of defining what justice is. And muddling through can mean very different things to different people.
Yeah. I think that's a great transition to...
Actually,
go ahead. No.
There's maybe a little more to explore here.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things in what you're saying there. And the first, which I think I very much agree, is that there is a foundation for justice, which is a sense of roughly, you might say, equality, at least equality of rights. Not necessarily equality of results, but equality of rights in the sense that I should not expect that the world owes me better treatment than any other random person out there. Now, you might say it's because we are all equally made in God's image, or you might say because we're all equally entitled to rights, or because you might say if we look at it from behind the veil of ignorance, I suppose that's sort of a Rawlsian perspective, we ought to recognize that we ought to be treated equally, although I suppose the veil of ignorance assumes the conclusion that we should be treated equally.
Absolutely. And I would think you would have some problems with the veil of ignorance.
I have some problems with everything. But so you could say that the trouble is it actually doesn't take you very far. Whether you say that we're made in God's image or that we should all be treated equally because there's no real basis for distinction, whether you say we're all sinful or whether you say, well, all of us have within us the psychological constructs that lead us to kill and rape and rob and such, not perhaps each individual one of us, but certainly lead us as a species. There's no doubt that that is so. Then in that case, whichever it is that you choose, you have a sense that there ought to be some mechanism of trying to accomplish justice despite these weaknesses, but it doesn't get you much by way of specifics. Now, the second thing is you might say, well, okay, Christianity at least, which goes beyond just those two insights, does give you some specifics. But here I have two concerns. I'd like to see what David has to say about them. So one is, just returning to the thing that I started with, I suppose if one did say, yes, one needs to accept the Bible as a basis for justice, or the teachings of a particular church as the basis for justice, then indeed it's true, one will be more likely to seek justice according to that particular framework. What it doesn't tell us, though, is why we should think that this framework, as opposed to all the other rival frameworks, whether religious or otherwise, is the right one. So again, it sounds like to assume the conclusion, say, well, Christianity provides for justice. And I'm not saying this is what you're saying, David, but some do say because it allows people to follow God's will. How do we know God's will? Well, it's expressed in the Bible. Well, yes, Christianity leads people to behave in ways that are consistent with Christianity, but that doesn't tell us that much. The second problem, though, as I see it, is actually I'm not sure just how much Christianity really gives it by way of answers to specific questions, just looking at the historical record. Christians have famously given completely different answers to questions such as slavery, questions such as abortion, questions such as religious freedom, questions such as democracy, the free market, I'm just beginning. We can come up with a vast list of other things. Blasphemy. And this is famous. Anybody who reads history sees just how radical the differences among Christians have been. And they're all people who I think were thinking hard about some of these issues that you mentioned. So just as an empirical matter, I'm not sure that Christianity will give much of a specific framework for answering questions. So I'm wondering what your thought on that is.
There's a lot of stuff in there.
There is.
So I'm just gonna take on some
Sure,
of it. But those are great points and really interesting ones. One is on the nature of justice. You talked about equality and the idea that we can probably agree that equality has to be at the core of justice. In my view, what justice is, and I suspect you may agree with me, is it's inevitably one way to. There are several different ways I think we can think about justice. I think if I were asked to define justice very simply, I would start by saying justice is right relationships among people, which gets us towards the equality. But another way to look at justice, it seems to me, is at the heart of justice is a trade-off between equality and liberty, as I see it. And I think that's what Rawls is getting at. That's what other people are getting at, that it's important to promote equality within a culture, but often when you promote equality, you necessarily are limiting the liberty of people. And Eugene is a constitutional law scholar, so this will sound kind of funny to him, I think.
No, not at all.
Because, well, the current Supreme Court is kind of collapsing those things together. It's using liberty to create equality. But I think there's a trade-off between liberty and equality that lies at the heart of justice. And I think you can see that in a Christian perspective on justice. The second thing I'll say is I think it's really important when we talk about issues where justice seems to have increased over time, particularly in the West, things like slavery, where we moved from one place to another, to acknowledge the role that Christianity has played in that. And this is not really a critique of Eugene in any way, but frequently when people talk about how just we are now, they act as if Christianity played no role in the civil rights movement, for instance. And that's just not accurate. Christians have some failings to explain. historically, but many of the things that we see as justice movements were anchored in Christianity and were anchored in Christian principles. Another issue Eugene raises is, why should you accept one of these perspectives rather than another? Why should you accept Christianity, particularly when there are different Christian views on things? And I think that's a great question. I think that once you accept Christianity, if you accept Christianity, it enables you to think about these issues. And although there's been lots of divergence on things, I think on a lot of core issues there's not a lot of divergence. But there still is the question, are we putting the cart ahead of the horse? I mean, why should you accept Christianity? And I think the answer to that has to be that you're persuaded that Jesus rose from the dead, that he was resurrected, and that our reconciliation with God is only through that resurrection and his sacrifice on behalf of our sins. And so then you have to talk about things, and maybe this is another dialogue between Eugene and me for another time, such as, is there any evidence for the resurrection? How is the evidence good or is it bad? There's not a slam dunk. There's not slam dunk evidence. We don't have a photograph of Jesus being resurrected, at least that I've seen. But people often, if you have one, show it to me, although I'll be a little skeptical, I think. But people often jump from that to a conclusion that there's no good evidence of the resurrection, and it's just this leap of faith. There's actually a lot of what I consider to be very good evidence of the resurrection. I'll just give two examples. One is the way the early church acted after Jesus' death. Even though they were persecuted, and the Bible talks particularly about the change in the Apostle Peter after Jesus' death, the early church was persecuted for decades. It would have been really convenient to disavow the resurrection. It would have been the safe thing to do, and they didn't do that. They seemed to believe deeply that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. Second piece of evidence, the fact that the primary testimony of the resurrection came from women. In first century Rome, the testimony of women was not admissible in a legal court. And so the fact that the Bible tells us that it was women who saw that Jesus was not in the grave, in my view, it's not slam dunk, but when you start putting these things together, there is a very plausible case that Jesus was who he says he was and that he was resurrected from the dead. And as a Christian, I'm not just taking a leap of faith. What I've seen in my muddling through persuades me that this is the most compelling explanation of the world. And a third of the world agrees with me on that. 2/3 of the world doesn't agree with me on that, and hopefully the 2/3 of the world, the rest will come around. The final thing that I'll say is, Eugene gave a number of examples of things that Christians have disagreed with on, and things that Christians have taken positions that now look benighted to us as well. And you didn't put it in those terms.
For my purposes, it was enough that there was disagreement.
Okay, so what I was going to say about that is, I've already said one thing, which is I think on many of the core issues there is not serious disagreement. I do think that there is lots of disagreement on various issues. I think it's also important to look at the trajectory of Christianity. So on an issue like slavery and civil rights, in the 19th century, there were Christians on both sides of that issue. Some of the strongest arguments against or in favor of slavery were made by people who identified themselves as Christians. So this is both disagreement, which is what Eugene is talking about, but it's also it's a position we rightly find unfathomable today. what I would say about that is another of the key selling points of Christianity is it is self-correcting. I don't believe you can read the Bible, particularly read the Bible now, and conclude that slavery, particularly the American style of slavery, is compatible with the Bible. Christianity, a lot of Christians have a lot to answer for in the 19th century, and I think even after the 19th century. But it's also the case that Christianity was at the heart of changing our culture on those issues as well. And it seems to me on the issues where there's not just disagreement, but views that look really problematic today, Christianity is self-correcting on almost all of those almost all of those issues. If you asked if that's consistent with what Christ died for and what he taught, you would conclude, no, it's not. And that view is going, that the benighted view is going to lose out over time. So to slightly qualify something I said earlier about my pessimism about justice, I think that's what Martin Luther King had in mind when he said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. I don't think it bends quickly towards justice, but I think in some ways it does.
Yeah, to make it a little, to quantify it a bit, and I should say there's no doubt that much of abolitionism in America was Christian abolitionism, though it's a little bit overdetermined in part because much of everybody in America back then were Christian.
That's right.
So it's hard to tell exactly what is owed to Christianity, but I will say that for 90% of the history of the Christian church, slavery was either tolerated or by some actually viewed as compatible with Christianity, and the most Catholic Majesty, the King of Spain, was a very major component of the slave trade, as were Protestants and as was pretty much everybody else, with probably a few exceptions here and there. So of course I'm delighted that the world in general seems to have largely seen the light on the question of slavery, and I don't want to fault Christianity as such for it, but it does seem to me that if we look to see that things are improving, if we ask, if it did take 1,800 plus years, in part perhaps because Christianity does in some measure, although in a very complicated measure, adopt an Old Testament which spoke quite neutrally about slavery, except slavery of Jews, well as our slavery. That's bad. It's the first day of Passover. Well, that was condemned, but slavery in general, that was out there. I just wonder to what extent one can sort of praise Christianity. I don't want to damn Christianity for this. I don't want to fault Christianity for this, but praise Christianity for its self-correction when it's self-correction for maybe 5 to 10% of the history of the Christian church.
Right. It's a fair and good question, and I would just say a couple of things about that. First is just to acknowledge that it's more complicated than I wish it were. But it is the case that for much of history, slavery, which looked very different from American slavery, the slaves were mostly people who were overwhelmed by debt. So a lot of slavery was debt-related, and a lot of slavery was war-related, was war captives. It was the primary economic engine of the Roman Empire in much of the ancient world. So it was in the water in the ancient world. That doesn't answer your question, but that just it's just putting it in a context that slavery was what made the economy go back then. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is the trajectory of the Bible very clearly destabilizes slavery. So I think if we look at the Old Testament, it looks somewhat neutral, although there are some complicating things for those who would advocate slavery in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we have the Apostle Paul saying there's no slave or free in Christ. There's no male or female in Christ. There are descriptions. There's a small book of the Bible that is a letter involving a slave that is written in a way that, first of all, makes clear the slave should be treated as an equal, and second of all, at least through our modern eyes, makes it clear that slavery is not justifiable, that it's not a sustainable relationship. So what I would say, and I'm really agreeing with with Eugene's point, is that the trajectory of the Bible is necessarily inconsistent with slavery. But I think it's a fair enough point that that didn't happen 2,000 years ago. That happened much, much more recent. And I mean, it's important to keep in mind that America is different from the rest of the world in this respect even now. In much of the world, slavery is still a real presence. We're unusual in that in most respects slavery is gone. I mean, there's some things that look like slavery, such as sex trafficking, even in America, but elsewhere in the world, there still is a fair amount of slavery.
So I think we're unfortunately nearing the end of our discussion here. But what I would love to hear, starting with Eugene, before we end the discussion and open it up to questions from the audience, is, what would it look like for you to have people here tonight be part of your vision for justice?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. Like, it's very easy for me to say, well, it's for you to agree with my vision of justice. I can give you a list of items, specific issues that I believe in, and other talks that will often involve me making an argument for one particular vision of justice, whether it has to do with organ markets or gun rights or free speech or whatever else. But that's not what you're really after. So the question, I suppose, is one of method. Well, I think part of it is, I do think that, I think what we would have to agree on is, you can't really seek justice unless you really think hard about it. It's not sufficient. People have thought hard about justice and have come to very, very bad results indeed. But I do think it's necessary to just be constantly thinking, look, here's the way we do things. There's some basis for respecting the way we do things because we've done them for a long time. That Burke, I think, had very good perspectives on this. But Burke, though he is the patron saint of modern conservatism, was far from a hidebound conservative. We also have to change the way we do things. But when we think hard about, is it fair what we're doing to people? So I think complacency in many respects is the enemy of justice, although there are other enemies as well. So I don't want to suggest that mere kind of active engagement is going to be enough. I think the other thing, which I have to say again, if you really are persuaded by the evidence of Jesus' resurrection, well, then sure enough, that's a pretty big deal. Any power that is capable of doing that, and that seems to have the one, they also have to be persuaded that the Bible authentically represents Jesus' words, was probably something we should care about. Not certainly. You could certainly imagine a world that was created by malevolent powers or by powers that are actually indifferent to us or that like to play tricks on us, but at least it's a pretty powerful argument. I do think that one needs to, just because of Veritas, one needs to think about that. One needs to think, what are the standards of evidence that we accept when people claim all sorts of things, whether it's about Mormonism or about Islam or about supernatural things, about aliens, about Elvis Presley, about werewolves, about ghosts. And by and large, we're pretty skeptical. There is this common saying, which I think is sometimes oversaid, but I think is correct: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it generally takes more than just, well, some people have said things, especially some people have said things many hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, for us to believe things. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is such powerful evidence that leads you to believe that. And if it does lead you to believe that, then you have to go where your beliefs lead you. But I do think that we ought to be thinking, just for the sake of truth, that whatever it is that we're going to do, hard to make it work unless it's founded on some sensible understanding of our desire to goal to seek truth. We need to think hard about it, and sometimes it leads again into difficult positions. I have no doubt that my position is a difficult one, but I do think that's one thing people need to do.
Thanks. What about you, David? What would it look like for people here tonight to play a part in your vision for what justice is?
So I'll say a couple things about that. One is, I agree with Eugene's point about the importance of thinking hard about justice. And one of the things that's really cool about this conversation, that if y'all aren't law students you won't realize, is we don't spend a lot of time talking about justice in law school. In fact, I think that's why this is not being held in the law school. It's being held in the business school, is why we're here, because don't tell anybody we're talking about justice. So I think I think that I think you do have to think hard about justice, and I'll say a couple more things about that. One is an answer to the question, what would it look like? Well, if you were to embrace the same Christian vision of justice, or the same kind of Christian vision of justice that I've embraced, well, it will look like very different things. So for some people, it might be getting actively involved in efforts to eliminate the sex trafficking trade. There's an organization, probably some of y'all are familiar with, called International Justice Mission, that's doing that sort of thing, and involved with using existing laws to try to free people from various forms of oppression around the world. Now, that's something that looks immediately recognizable as participating in justice. That's something that some of us might feel a desire and a call to do. For other people, I think it means other things. So it might mean trying to ensure better free speech in this country, and full enforcement of the constitutional right of free speech, which is what Eugene's an expert in. For me, it might mean trying to do whatever little things I can do to improve our bankruptcy system, so that people who need a fresh start have a fresh start, and that our bankruptcy system is consistent with a vision of justice. So it can mean all sorts of different things for different people. The other thing that I'd say, just to sort of pitch my Christian perspective on this one more time, is one of the really cool things about the Christian perspective on justice is, if you believe the things that I've been talking about, you will also believe that our lives are eternal, and that we are part of an eternal reformation process, that the world has been corrupted by our sinfulness, that God will ultimately, we don't know when, and we know that we're not capable of achieving justice, but God is. Being a Christian means participating in that project, and that's a project not just for now, but it's a project for all eternity. And I believe that one of the things that means is that the contributions, however small, however fragile, however imperfect they may be, that we make to justice today may have eternal significance.